And to be careful, we have to recognize that some of the strongest voices in favor of democracy in our Western experience, in our successful Western experience, that is successful in the sense that now everybody accepts that, are theologically dubious. The basic American document says, we hold these truths to be self-evident. The idea of a self-evident truth is itself, philosophically, to say nothing of theologically, somewhat open to question. That all are created equal and endowed by their Creator with inalienable rights. Among them, there might be more, but they couldn't agree on all of them, the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which is already a slight progress in the drafting process, because at first it apparently said the pursuit of property. There is no such thing as self-evident truths. If you are in a particular social situation where everybody thinks certain truths are self-evident, that just means you're in a particular province where other positions aren't represented. And then you have no questions. You certainly don't need to fight a revolutionary war if you all agree on what the truths are. What they said next, that everybody had to have a right to participate in the decisions made for their destiny, were things that most people hadn't ever believed, that had seldom been held by anybody in earlier centuries, that were recently weighty opinions rising out of both the British Reformation of the 17th century and the Continental Enlightenment, but both of them reasoned and contestable theses. So the whole confidence of the thrust that everybody knows that democracy is the best form of government was very deceptive. More realistically, they got away with it because of the non-democratic, aristocratic shape of their society, in which the whole intellectual world of the American seaboard was under the control of one school of thought. People like Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson, who were good communicators and good arguers, and nobody else was trying very hard to talk back. The people didn't want a revolution, didn't take it seriously enough soon enough to have a counterposition, so they were able to run with it and to win it. But the simplicity with which we assume democracy is right needs to be second-guessed. If it's to be justified, we have to think about better reasons. This is a specimen for the wider method questions that we face for the rest of the week, but we've already faced some of them, where you have to talk about a contemporary question without a final clarity as to a base in the New Testament. Sometimes the New Testament even seems to be saying something else, like the debates on slavery and women's rights, from what you would want to be in favor of if you were an ordinary, contemporary, self-respecting modern person. Other times, the Bible doesn't say anything at all directly, but has been used in the past on other sides, such as a biblical doctrine of sovereignty, of providence being appealed to in favor of the divine right of kings. We also have the further problem that a concept like democracy can mean so many different things in our time. It can be used to describe the mood, even, of a dictator. A dictator can claim to be a democratic dictator if what he does, he thinks, has the backing of the common people, but just not of all the literate people and the aristocrats who'd like to get him out of office. That's been the claim of numerous of the dictators of South America. But the people on their side, trouble is the people on their side are illiterate, and therefore they can't mount parties against him. The people that are against him, that oblige him to be a dictator instead of getting himself elected, are only the literate people. So you can use the notion of democracy even in favor of dictatorship. Even more easily, you can use it in favor of various kinds of elite governments, such as the one-party systems of most of Africa and the almost one-party systems of Eastern Europe. So the near universal agreement that democracy is good deceives us about some matters where maybe it isn't good. Or maybe the reasons it's good need to be thought about more carefully so that our affirmation of it is more responsible. There are some places where it doesn't work. Matters where truth or expertise is not dependent on a majority vote aren't helped by being voted on. It is matters of fact don't change even if you have an election in which you say this is the case. Facts of the economic mechanism. It's been notoriously difficult for certain socialist regimes to produce more food or fiber or other products off of the same land than was done before. That isn't because the land cares about socialism, it's because they tried to settle technical problems of agricultural engineering or economics by a doctrine that was voted on, or that at least claimed some kind of base in a political authorization, but it doesn't change the facts of what will make the fields produce more sugarcane. There are criteria of taste and culture that it's silly to vote on. Christopher Columbus, when he had landed in the New World, and the questions were just beginning to rise about whether this was really India, took a vote among his sailors to the effect that this was really India. And he told them if they didn't vote right, he wouldn't take them home. Now that's a good specimen of directed democracy, but it has nothing to do with facts. And there are many of the things that government has to deal with that depend on the facts, and where it's wrong to ask the majority. You have to ask somebody who knows, or you have to go out and count them, or measure them, or whatever kind of fact the claim is being made. It is quite possible that democratic process, when used in its ordinary ways, will prefer short-range over long-range values. And that is sometimes even not in the interest of the people voting, to say nothing of their grandchildren. It is possible for people to be swayed by less than valid appeals. Our phrase, demagogue, refers to somebody who gets the backing of the people, but for an unworthy cause or in an unworthy way. It's also the case that the democracy of this nation in its place doesn't help at all to take account of interests that are from some other people somewhere else. That is, citizens of El Salvador don't vote in American elections. And yet, they have a stake in what the American government decides. That democracy will never directly deal with, unless there's a special kind of communication effort. The seals and whales don't vote in Canadian Parliament. The future doesn't vote. There's nobody really informed about the stake of the future, although there are some parties that more than others, especially with regard to the contemporary ecological agenda. More than some other kinds of form of management, democracy depends on a very wide sharing of information. And yet some of the information is complicated and hard to share adequately. The sharing is itself skewed by both the bias and the quantitative overload of whatever communication media reach most of the people. So there are some elements of structure that should make us more sober about whether democracy is the best form of government, or at least what kind of democracy it would be the best form of government. This gets even worse than when democracy is equated with freedom, and freedom is thought of as the sovereignty of a nation, or even the persistence of a particular form of government within that sovereign nation, or even the maintenance of rule by a particular government within that form of government within that nation. That is the dominion of the present ruling class, which may have very little to do with anybody's interest except their own, but it's equated with the nation and with freedom and with democracy So that the dominant thrust of North American foreign policy, states more than Canada for the past generation, has been supporting freedom-loving nations around the world. And that just meant people on our side. It didn't have to do with the authentic quality of the governmental process in those nations, but it assumed that the defense of the sovereignty of any friendly government against unfriendly governments must be a part of the wider meaning of the positive values that our people have mandated. Now, the correction for these problems isn't to go back to royalism, but at least